What's up, everyone? I am back with another reaction video to a video called Has Science Made God Obsolete? The Great Debate. This is a debate that happened at Chapman University between theologian and philosopher Keith Ward, who I don't think I have ever heard talk, and Michael Shermer, who is like the head person, I think, at Skeptic magazine, and he's just a famous skeptic in that he basically defends science and the current beliefs of science in a very skeptical way against anything that's outside of the box of science. So without further ado, I'm gonna watch this. I'll probably turn it up a little speed wise and go from there.
Well, good evening, everyone. Wow, this is a fantastic crowd. I can't see much because of the lights, but I know that I never get as many people when I give my math talks. I need to change the title of my talks, I think. So I'd like to just give a couple of basic rules for tonight's engagement. First of all, I'm really proud to have these two distinguished guests with us tonight. This is what university is all about, is the ability of debate, very important and complex issues in an atmosphere of respect where ideas can be developed. My experience is that you probably already have an idea about the questions that are going to be discussed tonight, and I would bet that the majority of you won't change their mind by the time they leave the room. But to me, the best way to approach a debate is to try to lower your defenses and listen especially to the point of view of the person you think you disagree with. That's how we learn. We lower our defenses and we really pay attention and embrace ideas that we think we really disagree with. And then, of course, you respond to those ideas. But that's the best way, I think, to take advantage of this very special evening. I look forward to a very respectful evening, so you're welcome to politely applaud if you get something that you really like, but we ask you not to interrupt our guests or to heckle them if they say something you really think it makes no sense.
Right. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. Just out of curiosity, you see a show of hands. How many of you believe in God? Oh, crap. Oh, oh look at the time. Oh, boy. Well, okay. Many souls to save here tonight. Well, I used to believe in God. I was a born-again Christian. I was an evangelical. I went to Pepperdine University. I evangelized. I went door to door. We called it Amway with Bibles, knocking on people's doors to tell them about Jesus and so forth. And then later I became a born-again atheist, and I went around knocking on those same doors saying, I take it back, I was wrong. And then I became something of a militant agnostic, like that bumper sticker, I don't know and you don't either. I'm not sure what I call myself. I mean, I don't like the labels. I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist in that sense, although I don't know for sure that there's no God. But I have my suspicions about this that I'll discuss in a moment why. But that got me thinking, it's like the door-to-door thing. You know what you get when you cross a Jehovah's Witness with an atheist is somebody who knocks on your door for no reason at all, which I promise I won't do for you. The Jehovah's Witnesses do come by my house periodically. They have literature for me. I invite them in. I give them copies of Skeptic magazine, and they leave shortly thereafter. So the proposal...
Just real quick, that's, he's searching, goes to Christianity, goes to atheism, goes to agnosticism. He's quite outspoken, obviously, because he's the editor or whatever position he is in Skeptic magazine and so on. Just based on the story he just said, was very outspoken, knocking on doors, saying, hey, you should basically consider this thought pattern and believe this way. I don't know how you believe right now, but you should believe this way. This is the way to believe. Which, isn't inherently a false approach. It's just a matter of whether or not that which is being presented is ironed out and the flaws are as greatly as removed as possible. So in other words, the approximation of the perception of the individual is as limited as possible, meaning it's as accurate as possible. Obviously there's no way to be 100% completely, unequivocally, and absolutely accurate about every detail of everything, because the universe is infinite. having no end to its complexity, and so we can't know everything. But what we can do is narrow in on some underlying truths that are universal, so we can have those universal truths. And even in those cases, we still can't know everything, so there's always going to be something that's misinterpreted or just missing or unconsidered, unknown, any of those types of things. And that goes back to what that guy was saying. Should consider the perspectives of the people that we disagree with most. Now, whether or not that happens on the regular basis and changes us is another thing. Like if frequently when we listen to someone who we disagree with, the entire point is to then disagree with them. Like we're not really listening to what they have to say. And that's something that I've experienced in my videos. Like frequently I'll just get reactions in comments to something I say, like within the first minute or two of even saying anything. So they have no idea what I'm talking about. They haven't even exposed themselves really to anything that I have to say, but they feel a need to react. And I feel like that's just a human instinct, a human trait in any instance when we aren't really looking to learn, but we're looking to disagree with something. In any instance, when we're just looking purely to disagree, then we're not looking for actually listening. If we were to listen, that takes time, you know. We don't want to give it time. We just want to disagree. And so I find, interestingly, people comment and point out specific topics that I talk about in early parts of my videos almost exclusively. I wouldn't even say almost, exclusively. All comments that I've seen that are negative and oppose what I have to say and try to explain why I'm wrong are focused on some element of my presentation and referring to a video I have that's 2 hours long. It's within maybe 5 minutes, if that. If they made it 5 minutes without making a negative comment, it's they're one of the upper end ones for how long they made it without posting a negative comment. Just interesting. Anyway, just kind of sidetracked. Let me just get back to this. This is Michael Shermer. I've listened to him a lot, especially on the Joe Rogan podcast and other places. I don't really typically agree with his perspective. And as a whole, I mean, science is important, but my perspective is that he holds on too much to other people's ideas and doesn't necessarily critical think things through in areas. I mean, nothing against him. This is just universal, really. You know, we all are missing things, and the whole globe scientifically is missing things. I mean, we believe the Big Bang happened, which is just ridiculous. I mean, there's people who don't, but from a global consensus and people who generally accept the global consensus kind of standpoint, like, we believe things that are false. And then the interesting thing is then we build our perspective of reality based on them as if they're known, as if we know them to be true, when they're really just ideas that are not absolutely proven, that aren't even necessarily don't even appear to be proven because they have anomalies that essentially cannot be explained within the models. And so they're almost just like swept under the rug, or some new element is added, like dark energy, and we just add things. Like, that's not logical and sound. That's just maintaining a belief system and doing what we need to do in order to do that by adding some new shit. Okay.
On the table tonight is, does science make...
Also, this sounds like it's only coming through one of my headset, one of my right ear. So hopefully the sound is not too frustrating in the video itself.
God obsolete?
We
Yes.
laughed a little bit.
Do come by my house periodically. They have literature for me. I invite them in. I give them copies of Skeptic magazine, and they leave shortly thereafter. So the proposal on the table tonight is, does science make God obsolete? Yes. Thank you.
Before he goes on, this question implies that there is some capacity to even make God obsolete. If God exists, then God is. And if God doesn't exist, then God doesn't exist. So in essence, this question is under the almost proposed under the God doesn't exist perspective. It's almost as if their perspective is the only reason God exists for us as a society is because we need it for growth or blah blah blah, when it's not even about that. Underneath it all, if God exists, God exists. It's not a do we need God to exist, it's not do we blah blah blah, it's just it is, just like I am. Whereas if God doesn't exist, then this question kind of makes sense if we enter it under the premise that, well, do we need God? Is God a thing that is necessary? And if there is a God, then blah blah blah. And if there isn't a God, well, if we're in that perspective that maybe not, then we can say, well, we don't see any need for God, so God's obsolete. But that's really coming from an already off-center perspective, that either God that doesn't have the half that just if God is, God is. Like, that's a counterbalance to this type of perspective, in essence.
Well,
20 minutes.
It's okay, 20 minutes. Okay. Oh, boy. Let's see. I won't mention elections or Trump or anything like that. Well, we really have two hypotheses on the table, the God hypotheses and the science hypotheses. Hypotheses for what? For explaining certain mysteries, such as, well, basically two categories of mysteries, problems to solve.
Separating them. Just because we separate things in science doesn't mean we need to separate all things to the point where either there's God or there's science. It may be that science arrives at the conclusion that there's God, in which case they are not separate. They're actually part of one understanding of how the universe is.
The first are sort of natural disasters, accidents, fires, wars, conflict, just stuff that happens in our world, life and death and birth and so forth. What's the cause of all that? Why do things happen? And then the second category I would put just in the general origins category, origins of the universe, origins of life, origins of consciousness, and origins of morality, good and evil. So the two competing hypotheses then offer different explanations for these. So the God hypothesis rests on a supernatural explanation for these problems to be solved. So in the first category, supernatural, what do I mean by this? I mean, science deals with natural explanations for all phenomenon. If we can't explain it naturally, then it's okay to just say, well, I don't know. Let's just wait and see. Let's keep working on it. That's what graduate students are for. Assign them these problems to solve. But in the meantime, it's okay. I don't know what that light in the sky was, but before we proffer aliens and UFO, let's just say, I don't know. And that's always okay in science. So that's what I mean by natural. Look at natural laws, statistical...
Just for the record, that is not okay in science. Science likes answers. And if it doesn't have answers, it's going to find someone else who's going to give them the answer that they're looking for. And that's how science is where it is today. If we were to be like, we don't know, then the Big Bang wouldn't be the current model. Then general relativity would not be held as a standard model. And then quantum mechanics would not be held. All of these are known to be theoretical, to not be absolute, to have their flaws. And so if we were being honest, we would say, I don't know. We wouldn't say, well, it's quantum mechanics. Underneath it all, well, the Big Bang happened. No, that's not honest, as he's claiming science does, when in reality, science is just as biased as any other viewpoint. It just is under this like, 'cause, 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 ' what's the word I'm looking for? This guise of being reasonable and logical and methodic, and so it's much more potent in some ways because the people who believe it feel as if they followed a step-by-step approach to arrive at that conclusion, and so they feel that they're standing on sturdy ground. Whereas in the other end of the spectrum, people who truly just say, I have faith, they don't have to follow that step-by-step approach, but then they don't necessarily have the ground to stand on in the same way when their ground is faith, which is in a way it's another ground to stand on. Whether or not one is stronger than the other is dependent on the circumstances. But science is not so unbiased and neutral as people like to make it out to be, as he's doing by claiming we would say, I don't know, when that's not true.
Let's keep working on it. That's what graduate students are for. Assign them these problems to solve. But in the meantime, it's okay. I don't know what that light in the sky was, but before we proffer aliens and UFOs, let's just say, I don't know. And that's always okay in science. So that's what I mean by natural laws, statistics.
Something will fill that void of we don't know. Well, what are we going to do? We need to know. So we're going to fill that void with anything, and whatever that may be doesn't have to be true. It just has to fit the puzzle well enough that we embrace it and accept it and continue to build around it, just like doing a puzzle. But in the same time, if we do a puzzle, we can put a puzzle piece in a position where it looks as if it's in the right position, but later on we come along and say, that doesn't quite fit. I don't think that's actually right. And then we have to take that puzzle piece out and put a new one in. And then we take the puzzle piece out that we took out and put it somewhere else and say, well, that's where this fits. That fits in as an example of something that was not quite right. And then what does that teach us? And that teaches this. That teaches us that about the way we think and about the way we live and about the way we approach everything. We can learn a lot, and that's where it fits. It fits in. Our mistakes fit in as lessons and ways to learn things from and grow. And they're not just useless things that we take out and discard. They go somewhere else. Everything is a piece of the puzzle. It's just we put it in the wrong place and say, this is the piece of the puzzle that is absolute truth. This is part of absolute truth. When in fact, it's just not.
Statistical chance and accidents, things like this that explain the natural world and things that happen. So if we go through those categories, like the first of the two, human events. Before science, it was what I call the witch theory of causality. That is, if you believe that storms and diseases and accidents and fires and plagues and things like that are caused by women cavorting in the middle of the night with demons, then you're either insane or you lived 500 years ago when everybody believed this. That is, the name for the causal vector that causes diseases and accidents and plagues and so forth is a witch. A witch is a supernatural being, a kind of a demon. But in the whole general category, it's supernatural. And so what happened to the witch theory of causality? It was displaced. Nobody believes that, almost nobody in the world today believes that, because science has displaced this. We have meteorology and climatology to explain why weather events happen. We have insurance actuarial tables.
Try to.
And statistics to explain why accidents happen, why chance events play a strong role in our lives, black swans and all that. We have the germ theory of disease. So we know.
He's talking about systems that are infinite in their complexity, and yet we approximate them as finite by putting equations to them and all the things that we do to make it more understandable and analyzable for us. But the end result is that we don't actually achieve the objective of projecting the future, because that's what we're after, is determining how to control the future outcomes in ways that we're aiming to have them be. And so we cannot predict the future based on an approximate present. And that's what known as chaos theory. And he is pointing to sciences that do not understand chaos theory. These are not even taking into account the actual lack of variables that the science inherently and intrinsically has that make the predictions and calculations essentially approximations that may or may not be accurate. Depends on the circumstance.
What germs, bacteria, viruses, fungi, and so forth, what they do to people, what the chances are of these things happening, what we can do about it, and so on. So you no longer have to invoke witches, demons, and so forth. And you can just sort of go through the category there. Why do people kill one another?
Not some absolute
Rape, genocide, war, violence of all kinds. Why do these things happen? This is what social scientists do. We study these looking for causal vectors we can track, interacting variables, and so on. You don't have to invoke demons and possessions and witches and that sort of thing. So we've got a pretty good handle now on what supernatural causes used to explain in the human world. Then there's the category of the big origins. So these are slightly harder, and the reason we're talking about them is because nobody has final answers on those big questions. That is, the origins of the universe, the origins of life, consciousness, and morality, those four. So I've written quite a bit about these. I'm not a cosmologist, and I don't even play one on television. I just turn to my cosmology physicist friends and say, what do we know about the origins of the universe? Okay, well, we don't know for sure, but I recommend, say, Lawrence Krauss's book, A Universe from Nothing, and Leonard Mlodinow and Stephen Hawking's book, The Grand Design, is a good place to start. And that is that the idea that the idea that there must be a first cause is probably an artifact of our limitations of our thinking. That is, it isn't necessary that, it isn't true that all effects have causes. That's not true. Many quantum events are acausal. They're not caused. And so that takes care of that problem. The universe itself may be an uncaused, acausal event, a little fluctuation in the quantum foam of the energy that was there before there was matter and so forth.
Theory. Therefore, the universe is this way, and no, God does not exist. Like, whoa.
I don't claim to understand this. Mathematically, I'm not a physicist, but it's a reason.
Then why is he nothing against Michael Shermer? But if he's gonna say I don't claim to understand this, then he can't be going around and claiming to know what he's talking about. Either you know what you're talking about and you're up on stage talking about these things because you know what you're talking about, or you're just regurgitating what someone else told you on stage. Like, what is the point of that? Why would someone come on stage and just be like, this person told me this thing? Well, then where's that person? I get it that he's more of a generalist across many disciplines and bringing them all together, but just don't talk about it if you don't know what you're talking about. Don't say, oh, I'm not good at cosmology, I'm not a cosmologist. Well, it doesn't matter if you're a cosmologist. Do you understand the basis? Have you thought it through? If you haven't even thought it through and you're just kind of taking their word for it, then I feel like this is the result of that, because if you thought it through, you would understand at least their perspective, and then at that point you wouldn't say, I'm not a cosmologist. You would just go into the cosmology and the current models and explain why we think the things we think.
Reasonable hypothesis that could in principle be tested. Perhaps the gravitational wave research that's coming online now may test whether there's multiple universes, a multiverse. It could be brains, these sort of multidimensional things that bump into each other and create universes.
He's just quoting some shit he heard.
Universes could be created out of collapsing black holes in a singularity.
I mean, this is just nonsense. Science today is so backwards it doesn't even understand.
This is what Stephen Hawking worked on for his PhD thesis. These are testable in principle, testable hypotheses that could get us to that question. But even if you reject all of that, and the other three I'll go through in a moment, the supernatural answer, well, God did it, is not an answer.
Why do you have to reject all of that through the supernatural? Why can't it be through an actual scientific logical deduction that is based in reason and thought, that is not just jumping to the conclusion of, well, God did it? He's basically saying, well, science as we currently see it is as true as we can get it to be, and therefore the only way you could argue against our conclusions is by invoking God. But the truth is, science is wrong, and there's other avenues of interpretation of observations upon which science is built that doesn't have the same perspective on the nature of reality. There's many of them, but there's one absolute truth. There's one truth, and that truth may or may not arrive at God, it without even intending to, because if God is, then God is, and it will be seen through science. If that's the case, if we arrive at understanding of how the actual nature of the universe functions.
That's what we call the God of the gaps argument. There's a gap, I don't understand this, therefore that's where God did it. But that's not an answer. It's like that Sidney Harris cartoon where the mathematicians are at the chalkboard and they have these reams of equations, and then the one writes in the middle, and then a miracle happens. And the other one goes, I think you need to be more explicit here in step 2. Right, we have to have something more than just a miracle happens, or God did it, or that sort of thing. Something testable that we can sink our teeth into. Here I'm reminded of Carl Sagan's great story he's got in his wonderful book, A Demon-Haunted World. The chapter is called, I Have a Dragon in My Garage. And so he says, well, I have a dragon you have a dragon in your garage? That is so cool. Can I see it? Yeah, you can see it. Here you go. So you lift it up, you look in there, and I don't see it. It's an invisible dragon. Oh, an invisible dragon. Yeah. Well, let's put some powder on the ground, and we'll get his footsteps. You see, this invisible dragon floats above the ground about a foot. It never touches the ground. Well, but I have some infrared heat-seeking equipment here. We can detect the body heat. Well, you see, this is a coal dragon. It's cold-blooded. It doesn't give off any heat. Well, how about the fire? Dragons, they spit fire. It's cold fire. It's not detectable through, all right, at some point, you have to have some means of testing it, some way of detecting this supernatural thing, this thing you're proposing exists to explain things. And if you don't, what's the difference between an invisible, floating, heatless dragon and no dragon at all? And that I would apply to the God hypothesis. Whatever you're trying to explain, even if you don't accept any of the current scientific models for the origins of the universe, life, consciousness, morality, even if they're all wrong, centuries from now, we may look back on all this and go, wow, they believed in string theory? That was crazy. Yeah, I don't know. It's one of the best arguments for cryonics is get frozen and come back in 500 years and go, I was there when we did that. I wouldn't put my money on that just yet, though. Another area of skepticism. Origins of life. Okay, so there's half a dozen different theories for the origins of life. How do you get from inorganic molecules to organic molecules? We know where atoms come from, cooked in the interiors of stars, we're star stuff and all that good stuff. But how do you get first organic molecules and then protein chains and then cellular walls and then RNA?
It says we know where atoms come from, but the truth is we don't even know where the water on the earth came from. We have theories, and yet we know where atoms come from. It makes some blanket statement as if we know where all of the earth came from. And it's from stars, but okay, where did the water on earth come from? Comets? There's a lot of fucking water on earth. You want to say comets brought all of the water on earth? Have you looked at how much water is on earth? There's a lot of water on earth, so we can say we know where atoms came from, but what about the water on earth? If we can't even explain where the atoms on earth came from in terms of where did the water on earth come from, then how could we possibly claim to know as an absolute where atoms came from? And we all know that, so he's regurgitating, saying the thing that everyone loves to like romanticize. Oh, we're stardust. Hey guys, we're stardust. Like, that's cool. Okay, I get it, but also you're missing something. And that is, we don't know this as an absolute. We just kind of have arrived at that conclusion because we see supernova happen. We're like, well, that's how it happened, because supernova lead to the production of iron and all these other elements. And then when the supernova happens, all these other elements happen. And without a supernova, well, Earth's atoms would not exist. And so we're the stardust and blah, blah, blah. But where did the water on Earth come from? I mean, it's simple as that. Maybe it came from within the Earth due to the creation of a magnetic field, which is a flow of particles in a figure 8 orbital that then merged at the center of the planet due to rotation of the planet, just like spinning a spoon in coffee, stirring, the stirring motion, rotation, creating this vortex field that is an electromagnetic field that is made of particles that then float in a figure 8 orbital and combined at the center where all of these flow lines merge, which then creates atoms, and then over time builds pressure within the Earth due to the formation of water, which leads to and other atoms, which leads to the actual expulsion from the interior to the exterior, leading to oceans. In which case, well, then we're not really stardust. We're actually earth dust, in a way.
And then DNA and so forth. Okay, so there's people that do nothing but study this. They run experiments. They try different substrates that might hold molecules so they can become more complex molecules and so on. But again, it's one of these areas where there's no final sort of accepted theory that there's no concurrence or like the climate census. There's no origins of life census yet, but that's okay. Again, that's what graduate students are for. Just let's keep working on this. It's okay to say I don't know.
I gotta pause. Oh, I'm reacting a lot to this. I'm only 12 minutes in, but climate census. Just because a lot of people agree doesn't mean something's true. Gotta be careful with that line. He's just accepting it as fact and just presenting it as fact. Well, we know that this is true. We all agree on this one, but it's not like that one. It's this other thing where we don't all agree, but we know that in that one we all agree. Well, who said so? Just because some study shows that a lot of people agree, or we kind of generally see a lot of people agree, and because we say those people who don't agree are wrong, and so therefore their opinions don't matter. Again, going back to chaos theory, we cannot predict the future, and yet we're claiming as if some absolute climate change, we understand how the future functions. Get the fuck out of here. You don't know the future. You don't know what the climate will be in 5 years, 10 years. Let's look back at the history of predictions of climate change. Oh yeah, it's been wrong. So, no, not census. There's no agreement. Regardless of if there is some degree of agreement, there's no agreement in that it is a settled and undisputed topic, as he has proposed it to be by just mentioning it the way he mentioned it.
Like hypothesis number 3, more than 4 and 2 or whatever. But again, what's the alternative? Well, God did it. Well, how did he do it? See, this is what scientists want to know.
The alternative. Science, the alternative. So it's either what science says or the alternative. Again, it's under this assumption that science is even correct about its sciencing. It may be that science is just wrong about its conclusions, and therefore the entire picture of how it sees reality is false. And therefore, it's not the or God did it side. It's actually we need to figure out what the fuck is going on scientifically, and then we will see the reality, which includes the other side.
How did God do it? What forces? We have a pretty good understanding of the laws of nature, physics and gravity, electromagnetism, weak and strong nuclear force, and so forth. What forces did God use when he made RNA into DNA? How did that happen? Okay, so if you came up with an answer, I would just say, well, then that's still part of the natural world. So any God that might exist, if it's detectable by the means of science, is then by definition part of the natural world and is not whatever you might call this, omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, supernatural, outside of the natural world. If it's outside of the natural world, then it's no better than Sagan's invisible dragon. If we can put powder on the ground and detect God, then clearly God is a material being of some kind. Or maybe God is a supernatural being that occasionally enters the natural world to stir the particles, create stars or planets or life or whatever. All right, how does he do it? How do we measure the detection? How do we detect the stuff that's going on when he stirs the particles? Well, miracles. Miracles, okay, maybe. But what do you mean? Like, give me an example. Well, we prayed for, my Aunt Millie and her cancer went away. Okay, what kind of cancer? Well, it turns out it's one of these cancers that about 20% of them go into remission. Okay, so statistically speaking, if you have a large sample of 100 people, 20 of them will have their cancer go into remission. How do you know that it was the deity who did it or chance, whatever happens to tumors in their DNA that turns off and they quit multiplying? How do you know the difference there? In other words, the miracles were offered
by very, very careful consideration across a wide spectrum of topics that's not even related seemingly to what we're talking about. Then we can see the bigger picture of the nature of reality that we're part.
As empirical evidence for the supernatural deity reaching into our natural world to stir the particles to do something might have happened.
And not by just immediately saying, nah, there's nowhere. We can't know that. We gotta actually think it through. Think it through. Think it through.
Anyway. So how do we know?
Anyway.
How about something unmistakable? And I'm not just talking about a large deposit in a Swiss bank under my name, although I would be impressed with that. I'm not sure that would be supernatural, though. How about an amputee growing a new limb? There's lots of them since the wars we've been in. Most of them are Christian. Most of them have Christian families who pray for them. How come not one has grown a new limb? How come it's always stuff that might have happened anyway? So it's always right there on the cusp. Maybe it's a supernatural, maybe it's not. Maybe it's chance. Maybe it's the law of large numbers, stuff happens. How can we tell the difference? Okay, so that's the problem with that. Okay, so origins of the universe, conscious life, and then consciousness. Okay, again, the hard problem it's called. Not how the brain works, we know how the brain works. How does what we're doing here, thinking, feeling, experiencing, the qualia, as it's called, the qualitative experience, of feeling, of experiencing life, how does that happen? Okay, we don't know. It's called the hard problem. Again, half a dozen different theories. You go to these consciousness conferences where they talk about this stuff, and they each give up and give their talks and give their theories. Okay, let's go back and test them. Let's see which one is more likely than this one. I'd say we have a ways to go on that. Maybe a couple. It's always been, since we started Skeptic, we've been tracking this. It's always 5 years away, and always will be, I'm afraid, or at least a long ways away. Okay, maybe it's decades.
Until it's not.
But still, even if you don't like this particular theory or that one, how do you explain the theist? How do you explain consciousness? Again, you can't just say, well, God did it. Okay, how? I mean, I have a dog, a little chocolate lab. His name is Hitch, because, Christopher is a friend and an inspiration, but he only has about a quarter of the neural material I have. So although he thinks a lot about it, deeply important things like food and sleep and walks and his ball, but he's not contemplating how many more layers of neurons do you need to get? Chimpanzees, gorillas, dolphins, and at some point there's a tipping point. We know it can scale up. We know animals are sentient beings that feel, they sense things. So this gets into my fourth area of morality. We know there's a graded scale of a sense of right and wrong. You can teach little capuchin monkeys who have tiny brains. They're really small. They're smaller than Hitch's brain, my dog, not the real one. And you can teach them to do one of these little exchanges where they learn if they give you a stone, a little pebble, they get a piece of food back, and like a little cucumber. And then you can train them that if they use this other pebble that's even more valuable, they get a grape for a reinforcement. And they like grapes more than cucumbers because, who doesn't? And, we're all primates. Sugar is good.
I would pause and say, just because we observe brain size as different from our own doesn't mean it's necessarily superior. Our brain is necessarily superior. Well, this is some common thing we do when it comes to a lot of things like quantum mechanics. We think smaller is more fundamental, more basic, when in reality all particles function the same across an infinite spectrum of particles where they're all equals in essence. And I would say the same thing goes for brains. We may see them as smaller brains, but that doesn't mean that they're not equally as capable of thought and experience and understanding what's going on around them in their own way, that we may not understand what their thoughts are and why their thoughts are the way they are, but that doesn't mean that their thoughts are any less valid and deep and meaningful, and their experience any less just of a true experience in the same way as ours is. I mean, we don't know that. We're just making assumptions, and one of the way we make assumptions, one of the ways is by saying, well, this brain is smaller, therefore it's not as intelligent. And I mean, the universe is fractal. What that means is that there's different levels that all function the same. And so, and we can see this in heartbeats, for instance. No matter what the species, essentially all have the same amount of heartbeats. And I would argue that's because we, regardless of our rate of experience of time, every observer experiences time passing in their own way, and that a insect, for instance, experiences time, let's say 2 weeks of their lifetime, in the same way as we experience time. Let's say they experience an entire lifetime in what we think of as 2 weeks. And to us, an instant is very quick, but to an insect, that instant may be days, or not a much longer perceived passing of time, which would be related to their heartbeat in essence. We just don't know, but we assume we know when it comes to intelligence and things of this nature, when really it cannot be ignored. We are all equals. That is a fundamental truth that if we're not accounting for it, we're missing something. And so when he says this about the brain, of this comparison where we're not equals, we're basically above, well, that's just not, that's missing things.
Good. And so, but if you put them in, there's a famous experiment by Franz de Waal. You put them in this cage, translucent cage, where one's here, they're swapping their stones and getting rewarded. They're very excited. And then the one on the left gets a stone. He gets a grape, and the other one sees this, and he's very excited. Like, oh boy, I'm gonna get a grape. And then he gives his stone, and the experimenter gives him a cucumber slice. And you see in the video, he goes like boom, like that was not cool. And he pounds the cage and rattles the walls. That's a sense of injustice. That was not cool. I am pissed. He got something better than me. I gave the same amount. It's kind of like the Capuchin version of income inequality, I guess. People that don't like that. I get the same job. I get half the pay. Not cool. But where does that come from? Okay, so we have that. Capuchin monkeys have that. Almost all primates have this. Sentient beings have a sense of right and wrong. So this is where we get it. So you can scale up from lower organisms to higher organisms. All sentient beings have a sense of suffering, which is another argument for animal rights. But anyway, that they have a sense of, that hurts. I don't like that. Hurts either physically or emotionally in a fairness, justice kind of way. And then finally, well, what about right and wrong? I'm not talking about the moral emotions, where they come from. We can I wrote a whole book about this. We know how that comes about. What about what's actually the right or wrong thing to do? Where does that come from? Again, the theist answer is, well, God tells us about this. Well, how do you know? Do you pray about this? Do you talk to God and say, well, I'm really conflicted on abortion, or I'm conflicted about stem cell research, and you get to hear a voice? Well, if you're hearing voices and you're not in church, you could be in trouble with the psychiatric profession. Okay, so most people don't rely on prayer. It's like that famous Sam Harris line about, when President Bush said he was talking to God about whether we should invade Afghanistan or not. And, then God gave him direction however this happened. And as Sam said, if he was talking to his hairdryer instead of God, this would evoke a national emergency. So what's the difference? Why does adding the hairdryer do anything more than what's actually happening? In any case, we know he wasn't channeling Yahweh and Jesus. He was channeling Cheney and Rumsfeld. Okay, not prayer. Well, how about my instincts, my internal small voice? Yeah, okay, I have that too. Where does that come from? Well, it's part of our evolved nature. It's part of our culture. We're raised in a secular environment since the Enlightenment. We have certain values about people should be treated equally under the law, that all people are born with, that they should not be used as a means to an end, but are ends in themselves, Immanuel Kant, and so forth. You can sort of build a secular society based on these principles, which we all do. Then what theists do is they back into it stuff that they can find in the Bible that kind of sounds like equal rights or equal treatment kind of arguments. But if the Bible then is your source,
he makes it as if systems of government, of law, of man. So this is his thing. Law, when we make up a law, which is what we're doing, did I agree? Did you agree? who exactly among us agreed to the laws that they are expected to be complacent and complicit and subservient to? None of us. The only ones who even have any say are really the ones doing it to begin with, the politicians and so on. But even them, I mean, we're way past, like in America, I mean, all the founding fathers are dead. You know, we're past that stage. Now we're just stuck in this system that has been passed down over and over, where we have no say in the matter on at least a relative scale. Obviously, revolutions happen, things happen where changes occur within the structure of society, but we can't say, no, I opt out. That's not part of the structure. Now the thing is, why can we not? Because we claim that it's the law. Well, which law? Is it the law, or is this just some shit we made up? Because to me, it's some shit we made up. And any system of government can be literally disputed in one phrase. Two wrongs don't make a right. That's that. So go away with the system of government that attempts to do a wrong, such as imprison, which is putting someone in a cage, any act, fine, which is stealing, taxation, theft. You know, two wrongs don't make a right. Yes, we have things we need to do in society, and we need funds to support those things. But if you just take it from people, that's wrong. So it sucks. Sorry, it's not so easy to get things the way you want. So you can't just take it. That's not how it goes. But that's what we do. We just take it. And then while we're taking it, we just skim a little more off top for some other things that we are a little, concerned about. You know, the Russians are invading sooner or later. China is gonna become number one power in the world, and we can't have that. So we need you to help. You're gonna build the roads, so we're gonna tax you for the roads, for the infrastructure, and then we're also gonna tax you for some. Just don't worry about it. Just go back to sleep. And we probably need some of your children. You know, we'll train them. Don't worry. We'll pay them with the money we took from you, and probably print some money because we have such a high demand. You know, we need a lot of stuff, so we're just gonna print some shit now. Don't worry about it though. It'll trickle down. It'll work out in the long term. I swear. This is not in any way unsustainable, and so we're just gonna go ahead and, you know, conquer the world, because we're right. You know, we're right. World deserves conquered. It needs a democracy. It needs our laws, because we figured it out. We made these laws. Did you ever look at the Constitution? Like, really look at it? It's fucking stupid. It's like immediate first sentence almost. It's just jumps right into, hey, here's the structure of the government. And by the way, don't worry about all the reasons that we decided to create a new government. This is the structure now. This is how we're gonna go ahead and do that. We won't make it important though, because that's just secondary. Even though that's the whole reason we did this. Okay.
Of right and wrong.
And rant.
How do you explain just basic stuff like the creator of the universe, who's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, couldn't even get it right on slavery? He could not just knock out number 7 of the 10 Commandments.
What is this about? So many assumptions. This is one of the most common things that we do to dispute God. We say, well, there's this thing that we disagree with, and see no purpose to it, purely evil. And the thing is that freedom is just that valuable. That's how valuable freedom is. That in the perception of a omnipotent being, that's how much they value freedom. That they allow things that they don't agree with. They're like, okay, you're gonna do that now, huh? All right. It's your right because I let you be free. Truly, you are free to do whatever you want. And so it happens. What about that? What about that possibility? No, God is just not omnipotent, not benevolent because of the existence of this, even though we have freedom to make our own decisions, which is pretty valuable. I mean, we could have a perfect world where everything's just fine and dandy, but we can't actually think or make any decisions on our own. I mean, I guess that could exist. That doesn't sound very nice to me, though, because we'd be just robots without meaning or thought, without anything, just experiencing nothing. That doesn't sound optimal. Freedom sounds optimal, which unfortunately has its side effects in the short term while we come to realize the nature of reality.
Well, that's probably a good one, actually. Maybe number 3 or 2. And put in there, thou shalt not enslave thy fellow humans. Just put it in there. You couldn't do that. I mean, where is the sense of injustice of things that we're riled up about today? Where are those in? Okay, so the holy books, not to mention the fact that there's more than one, so which is the right one, leaves us with no hope for turning to.
Which is the right one implies that there's some finite picture of reality. Universe is infinite. All things are infinite. There's no end to the depth and to the amount of truth that can be found across everything. But if we limit our view to one thing, then there's no truth in it, because we're basically limiting ourselves. And so when he says which is the right one, well, none are right, including science. Nothing is right by itself. The only time there is something that is right is when they're all combined into one picture. Like a picture. Like if we say, what is this picture? And we only look at one pixel, then we're not going to make out what the picture is. Doesn't matter what that pixel is.
To there, but clearly we should turn to ourselves. And science and reason is the best arguments for that. So in sum, I think, how's my time? 2 minutes, okay. So, well, just sum up then. Okay, so the 2 hypotheses on the table are the God hypothesis, the science hypothesis. To explain all those things, human events, causes, disasters, disease, and so forth, and then the origins of the universe, life, consciousness, and morality. We have cogent explanations for many of these. We have reasonable, rational, testable hypotheses from some others. We can see that just saying God did it, that's a God of the gaps argument. That doesn't get us there, doesn't add anything. You don't need to add the extra entity there. There's no need for that. It doesn't bring anything more to the table. It's just a word.
Need.
At some point, we want to know how did the deity.
It's not about need. It's about is or isn't. Either yes or no. It's not a need thing. Oh, I need this. I need God. Well, guess what? It's not about need. It's about what is, man. The nature of reality, period.
You do this. How did this happen? And so we're really left with ourselves. And that's actually good. That's okay. We should be comfortable with that. And just say, we don't know everything, but we're working on these problems here, and we're getting there. And so therefore, I would conclude that science, in this sense, makes God obsolete. Thank you.
Oh, my God. Makes God obsolete. Again, we come back to the beginning of what I was saying. Only in the sense is it obsolete if we are under the premise that either God may be or may not be, but we have no attachment to it. And so we are leaning already towards God doesn't exist. And so science basically disproves God in a sufficient way where God becomes obsolete. It's not a question of obsolete. It's a matter of is or is not.
Thank you very much. And now the word to Professor Ward.
I'm a preacher, so I need a pulpit. Now, that was very clear, and within its limits, a very convincing exposition of what a scientific explanation would require of us. And in the course of it, Michael referred to the expression, the God of the gaps. That expression was first made public by Charles Coulson, who was an Oxford mathematician, who said, "We do not want a God of the gaps. We want a God who is present at every space and time." And Charles Coulson was a Methodist minister as well as a mathematician. And the real question here is, hasn't Michael just totally missed something about God? And the most important thing about God. When people go into churches, for example, they don't typically think about the beginning of the universe and how Stephen Hawking has explained it and whether it's a good explanation. They would be just as mystified by this as the rest of us. They don't ask about the origins of life and try to analyze the theories of Max Planck or Paul Davies and compare and contrast them. They don't do science at all. Worshipping God is simply not a scientific activity. Well, what is it then? Well, I think God is a being who is believed to be a mind-like. I want to be a bit agnostic about knowing exactly what.
He's dividing again. Doing the same thing but opposite, which is interesting. I've never heard this guy. Why separate God from science, though? The only reason to do that is because it appears as if science is not supportive of God, and so, well, that's that. We're over here. We're doing our thing. Separate. I don't like it. I think it's an unsound argument to make to a scientist, especially because they will jump all over the logic and reason in that and be like, well, you're just ignoring science. Why are you ignoring science? Look at all this evidence we have. All you have is faith in some book that was written by people thousands of years ago. I mean, why are you listening to that? Well, my experience. Well, what about all this science? Oh, it doesn't matter. That's not a good argument. Need science to understand the nature of reality, period. But we also need everything else, is what science needs to understand. Everything is part of the picture, and nothing is by itself the picture.
God is, but say a mind-like, at least a being who is conscious, who is a being that we can relate to in worship and devotion, whom we can revere and admire and seek union with. And the life of religion is a life of prayer and contemplation and meditation. That's what it is. If you're a religious person, you're a person who practices a discipline which will lead you to consciousness of the mind of the universe. And that's a practical activity. It doesn't really have directly anything to do with science at all. It doesn't much matter how the universe began or how life originated, because those aren't the questions you're asking. You may be interested in those. They may be relevant. What you're asking is it true that there is a being who is of supreme value and to whom I can consciously relate and who can transform my life so that I can even say that I participate in the nature of that supreme consciousness? That's the religious question. Not everybody's interested in religion, but that's what religion is about, and that's what belief in God is about. So it's simply not a scientific hypothesis. And when Michael says, well, the religious person comes along to a scientific view and says, oh, well, the answer to that is God did it, I don't think any intelligent believer has ever said that at all. We don't use God as any sort of scientific explanation. And the interesting thing is that Michael limits explanation to scientific explanation, what he calls natural explanation. And of course, that's what the sciences deal with. In Britain, the sciences are called natural sciences, meaning they deal with physical things in space and time. Now, lying behind that definition is a philosophical view. And the philosophical view is there is nothing but physical things in space and time. And that's the view I want to challenge. In fact, I think it's a view which is even scientifically obsolete. But let me say a little bit more about that. If you were a materialist and you thought there's nothing but things that exist in space and time, you wouldn't, for example, be able to do what many physicists of my acquaintance now do, believe in a multiverse. Because if you believed in a multiverse, you'd believe there are lots of different spaces and times, and those other spaces and times aren't in this space and time, and in fact, they're not in any space and time at all. How can you have spaces and times in a super space and time? That sounds suspiciously supernatural to me. So even modern physicists are a bit distressed at the thought of everything having to be in space and time. And I asked the three best-known philosophical naturalists in Britain to do a conference at Heathrop College, where I'm associated now, and they came, and every one of them said, actually, we can't define naturalism. We can't define materialism. In the old days, perhaps we thought we could, but now with quantum physicists, and there's some very good quantum physicists here at Chapman University, quantum physicists say, well, actually, no, you can't define matter. It's a form of energy, but it may have many forms, and many different forms than the ones that we see and touch and feel. The world is not as simple as that. So my big question, really, to Michael is, do you really think that all there is stuff in this space and this time, and that every form of explanation must talk about something in this space and this time? Why limit things like that? And a similar question is scientific explanation, what Michael called natural explanation, is that the only form of explanation there is? What about art and music and beauty and morality and personal experience of other people? Do they all fall under scientific explanation? I don't think they do. If you have Beethoven's Ninth Symphony on a CD, you can give a scientific explanation of how you got the music onto a binary code and how you got this onto a machine that will turn it back into music if you do it properly. You can have an explanation of how to do those things, but explaining Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, well, you wouldn't even use the word explain, really. You'd think appreciating. That's the word we want. We want to learn to appreciate something that is not physical. Or at least, even if it's physical, you're not approaching it in an analytic, physical way. You're listening to the music. So somebody could know everything about the scientific explanation of electromagnetic waves of sound hitting neurons on the brain, which makes them vibrate at a certain rate and gives people pleasure. You can do all that, but you haven't begun to appreciate music. And I would say religion is more like appreciating the true nature of reality than it is like giving some physical explanation of an unknown fact. In fact, it's not like that at all. It's not like giving a physical explanation at all. Religion doesn't explain. What true religion says, that's the one I believe, of course, what true religion says is the ultimate reality is mystery. And we contemplate mystery. It's not total mystery, as though there's nothing there or we don't know what's there at all, but it's far beyond our understanding. It has the nature of mind, but a mind greater than ours, a mind which can, however, transform our minds as we come to know it. What we know, said St. Augustine, changes what we are. We become like what we know. And those who think of God as a supreme beauty and the supreme perfection hope to become more like that beauty and perfection as they take into their own minds the thought of that mind of all things. So the real question is, well, what is the nature of reality?
First of all, I don't agree with his approach. I mean, I don't know his background. He doesn't sound very scientifically aware, educated, whatever it may be. More just religious in his background, and same problem as Michael Shermer, that there's this disconnect across the two, because neither is actually studying the others in depth and trying to understand their actual perspective, which is interesting considering we started the talk off the guy saying listening to the other person is a great way to understand that person. They're so disconnected from each other. It's almost, there's no way, as they said, there's going to be any acceptance of the other's perspective. But just because we think we know something and then become like what we know kind of concept, we still have a perception of God. And if our perception of what is God is limited, then we're becoming, even if we're becoming like that God, it's still a limited perspective of that infinite nature. And so that's where science comes in. If we don't understand the nature of reality, then how can we possibly become like God, which is reality? What's up, Portal? Recording a reaction video, so my camera's over here. What up, peeps?
And I want to suggest to you that it is the nature of mind, that underlying all this apparent physical stuff, there is something like consciousness, something like spirit. Now, Michael might say, consciousness, nobody can explain what that is, because how do you get consciousness out of a group of neurons and physical stuff? Actually, consciousness doesn't need that sort of explanation. I think scientists should go on looking for it, but I don't hold out much hope that they ever find an explanation, because you just can't explain the connection between the physical goings-on in a human brain and that sound and sight and vision of beautiful music, beautiful landscape, moral transformation. No, the realities of life, falling in love. You can do lots of scientifically relevant stuff, but you might miss the reality of love itself. So all of the things of value in our experience are precisely experiences. Consciousness in ourselves is the first thing we know. It's the most obvious thing we know. And of course, I'm a philosopher, really, and so my problem is not what consciousness is, it's why we have bodies. My wife would say, I ought to know by now, but I do have a problem with that. Why do minds need bodies? Now, that's a really interesting question. God, of course, would be a mind without a body. Would Michael really want to say that's an incoherent notion? I have never seen a proof of any sort that there could not be a consciousness without a body. In fact, I can even imagine it. For David Hume, that would be enough, so it's enough for me. That is to say, I can look at myself in the mirror, and as I look, my body disappears, but I'm still thinking. So I can imagine having experiences without having eyes. Well, we all know that's possible. We all know it's possible to put a brain in a vat and by stimulating it, make it have experiences. I mean, in stories anyway, this happens quite a lot. But you can think of consciousness without a brain. I mean, I don't think humans, don't get me wrong, I'm not denying you have brains. I think you probably do. But I do think that your consciousness is not identical with your brain. It's not part of your brain. It's certainly connected strongly to your brain, but it's the most real part of you. In each of you, there is something individual, unique, that only you know about, you probably won't tell anyone else about. There are things about you of which you have direct awareness that you couldn't even express. That's the reality of consciousness. And if you think, well, maybe consciousness is just not an accidental byproduct of the material universe, but actually the reality which gives rise to a material universe. Now, I'm not going to, and I'm not competent to go into quantum mechanics here, but I do know that there is an outstanding institute for quantum studies in this university. And I've talked to one or two other people in that institute, and they have my permission, I have their permission, I have their permission to say that they think that consciousness has a much more important...
He's saying people, but he said one or two, which makes me suspicious of who people is, because it sounds like person. And he's trying to exaggerate it by saying people, but he's trying to not lie about it being only one person by saying one or two, which is kind of what? Like, what is it? Like, you don't remember? I don't understand. Why are you trying to make it sound like this is more than it is? Before he gets into whatever he's about to say, I just thought that was a little deceptive in some way. Not really, but enough that I picked up on it, that there was something going on there.
And I've talked to one or two other people in that institute, and they have my permission. I have their permission. I have their permission to say that they think that consciousness has a much more important place in our understanding of reality than old-fashioned, obsolete Newtonian science would have said.
He says lay, so that's so weird. You can't say one or two, and like what? And then say lay. Okay, so not one. Not actually one, so two? But why did you say one or two? That draws into question like everything he's saying. And then I feel like he even stumbled over his words and made some like little joke to detract from that it happened.
And if you think, well, maybe consciousness is just not an accidental byproduct of the material universe, but actually the reality which gives rise to a material universe. Now, I'm not going to, and I'm not competent to go into quantum mechanics here, but I do know that there is an outstanding institute for quantum studies in this university. And I've talked to one or two other people in that institute, and they have my permission. I have their permission. I have their permission to say that they think that consciousness has a much more important place in our understanding of reality than old-fashioned, obsolete Newtonian science would have said. That somehow, for very complex reasons, maybe we live in a participatory universe, not a mechanical universe. And a participatory universe is one in which consciousness and matter come together in a way that is inseparable, and the consciousness actually makes a difference to the very material things we see. Let me give you a quick example of that. We're all sitting in this room now, and as you look around you, you think you are seeing, you believe you are seeing, solid, three-dimensional, colored objects, other people. And you are. But if you ask a quantum physicist, well, what's really in this room? If you all shut your eyes, what would be here? Right? What would be in this room if you all shut your eyes? But there wouldn't be any solid three-dimensional colored objects in this room. What would there be? Well, I don't understand what they then go on to tell me, but I can repeat what they said. And they say, well, one of my colleagues in Oxford certainly said to me, and it's been confirmed a bit this week at this university, what you get is a set of probability waves in Hilbert space, which is 11-dimensional, and in which actually there are no colors or solidity at all. So I tend to say, well, thanks very much for that, and what's it like? And they say, well, you know what 3 dimensions are, just imagine 11 dimensions. Okay, right, I give up. And that's the point. These days, I think in physics, we all give up. Right? Even the best quantum physicists, even Stephen Hawking too, as well, although he's not a quantum physicist technically, but even he would say, we don't know. Stephen is much more agnostic than you might think. And I think Michael mentioned the grand design, I read that book carefully, and in it, Stephen explains everything by the use of some theory called M theory, about which Stephen Hawking's great collaborator on the black hole thing, Roger Penrose, said, M theory isn't even a theory, it's mathematically just not formulated yet, it's a faith. And there's the point. Physicists are people of faith. They believe that there's nothing but matter. They believe that scientific explanation will explain everything in the end. They believe that though we haven't formulated M theory properly yet,
It will. Don't do that. It will. It will play its part. That's for damn sure. in explaining everything. The problem comes in when we say current scientific interpretation is what will do this thing. That is not true, at least not as a whole. Parts of it will play roles and so on, but everything is going to be completely resurfaced and moved around to such a high degree that it won't even resemble modern day science when we really understand the nature of reality as a society.
Yet it's a faith. And there's the point. Physicists are people of faith. They believe that there's nothing but matter. They believe that scientific explanation will explain everything.
I don't like his... He's not a... No offense to him either. He's not a good person to put up here because his knowledge of science is too limited. He's basically saying that he just hasn't considered science very, very deeply. He's listened to people talk about it, but he hasn't really thought about it enough.
In the end, they believe that though we haven't formulated M theory properly yet, we will. We'll do it. There's a blank check on the future. This is faith. Religious people say, oh, I'm not so sure about that. One of my colleagues in science, Paul Davis, says that actually physicists talk more about God these days than theologians do. And there's something in that because the stuff's all got so hard to comprehend. But the point I'm really making is even in hard science, it's not so clear what natural explanation would be. And it might be the case, it's controversial, but it's certainly of great high quality work. Consciousness might be essential to it. Roger Penrose himself, he said he thinks any future physics will have to take consciousness much more into account. Now that is relevant because belief in God is belief that behind it and enveloping this reality is a pure consciousness, which is expressed in all the things of the world. Now, I'm not going to get into problems about suffering, etc. I just say all those things, whatever they are expressions of the consciousness of the cosmos. And to begin to know that, perhaps it's more mysterious than many of us think. It's not a simple Sunday school thing, but to begin to know that is to pray. It is to contemplate. It is to look, as St. Augustine put it, for that perfect beauty which is known...
Okay, first thing, God, give it to me. That's kind of fucked up, sorry. I mean... There's no shortcuts. Or maybe there are shortcuts, I don't know. Who am I to know? In my experience. I just found it interesting. That was the first thing he said. The way to know that is to pray.
It's not a simple Sunday school thing, but to begin to know that is to pray. It is to contemplate. It is to look.
Is to contemplate, is to think, is to actually explore one's thoughts, one's ideas, one's experiences, everything. To contemplate. That's not praying. Praying is not contemplating. They're actually, it's almost submitting to the moment to think and not to ask for more or ask for anything. And in that instance, then we can think in a way.
Augustine put it, for that perfect beauty which is known in and through every beautiful thing in this universe. And to look for that perfect intelligence which is known in and through every quantum law, every beautiful mathematical theory. And you know, I've got a great mathematician sitting next to me here, but I'd say most mathematicians say to me, mathematics is a thing of beauty. And you look for equations of beauty. And the amazing thing, I think it was Eugene Wigner who said, mathematics is unreasonably descriptive of what the real world is like, and it's beautiful and it's elegant. Why should it be? You know, back in Britain, physicists can't afford to have experiments anymore, so they have to write things on the backs of envelopes. And when they write things on the backs of envelopes, they turn out to be true. How could that happen? How could pure thought in mathematics give rise to something that is real? As Stephen Hawking put it, what breathes fire into equations? You've got the equations of quantum mechanics, and you say, oh yes, as Michael did say, well, universes can come out of quantum foam, whatever that is. And so you say, yeah, but what makes the equations operate over anything at all? What does that? Now, I'm not saying God did it. I'm saying to explain that properly, and we're nowhere near explaining it properly, you'd probably have to bring consciousness into play somewhere. And the thought of that consciousness which makes electromagnetic
Speak for yourself.
vibrations in 11 dimensions turn into solid objects like you. You are the appearances of a veiled reality. And that veiled reality is the expression of the mind of God, the consciousness of the cosmos. You may not agree with that. But even if you disagree with it, the point of this debate is we're saying, does science, does a commitment to the natural explanation of things, make the idea of a cosmic consciousness obsolete? And I wanted to suggest to you that it doesn't make it obsolete at all. I mean, there may not be a cosmic consciousness, but the idea that there is an idea which virtually every great classical philosopher has embraced in some form. It's not a weird idea. It's not like believing in fairies or spaghetti monsters or dragons in Michael's garage. It's not like that. It is something that every great philosopher has wrestled with. And if you haven't wrestled with the question of, is consciousness a fundamental constituent of this universe and not an accidental byproduct of it, if you haven't wrestled with that, you haven't really thought about the nature of human existence. So I think God is a fundamental question about human existence, and whether you say yes or no to it in the end, you're going to say it's not a scientific question.
That part of it, not all. And he said the, and this kind of like Michael did, the nature of consciousness or whatever he said. You haven't really thought about it. Well, that part of it, that doesn't mean you haven't thought about it. It being everything.
Because you have to ask the question, are all questions scientific questions? And I think moral questions are not scientific questions. Aesthetic questions about beauty are not scientific questions. Even historical questions are not scientific questions.
That's his perspective. Everything is connected. And so everything is in some capacity a scientific question. Whether or not we've made the connections to really see it in its infinite detail, which it has, then is irrelevant.
Questions about love and human feeling and human emotion and thought, they're not scientific questions. And questions about God are not scientific. Let me end by making a contrast between two sorts of explanation.
Oh, hell yeah, they are.
I could just talk about one of them, scientific explanation. Of course, there is such a thing. You get the initial states of a system, and you get a set of laws which say what will happen if that state carries on according to these laws, and that's what you look for in science. And you hope these states will be describable, measurable, quantifiable, and you'll be able to get clear mathematical equations for them. Right, that's good. That's scientific explanation. But there's another sort of explanation, and I invite you to consider whether you think it's a proper and irreducible form of explanation. That is a form which doesn't reduce to scientific explanation. Some people call it axiological explanation. You could call it value explanation. And it's this. If you come to an event like this and I ask you why you come, I do not want you to say, well, my electrons came and I just had to follow them. Right? I don't want a scientific explanation. I want to know why you came. So I want to know that you formed an idea in your mind of a state of mind which was future and so did not yet exist. You had an idea about something that doesn't exist. You then evaluated that idea and you decided, yeah, maybe it was worth coming. And then you made yourself come. That is to say, somehow you got your body to move to get you here to do what you'd wanted to do in the first place. You came here for the sake of what you hoped would happen when you got here. And that's for the sake of. That's value explanation. You think of a value, you conjure it out of your mind, and you try to bring things about which will realize that value. That's value explanation. Now, I think that explanation is of fundamental importance. It's not scientific. Science doesn't deal with conjuring ideas about the future or with having purposes. In fact, science doesn't use that concept at all.
How is science unrelated to a value calculation?
If can help it. Having a purpose and an intention and an enjoyment.
Even if it's something we're unconscious of doing, if we're assessing value, there is some scientific aspect of our actions in terms of making calculations, deducing the best decision to make in a given moment. To completely remove science from it is not the correct approach. These are not things that can be disconnected from each other just because we want to. God, the nature of reality, science, everything's connected. There's no disconnecting them. When we try to, we form approximations that then are just not true. So even if we try to, we can't do it because we're not going to arrive at truth. We may be able to do it to a point where we create some kind of false reality in our minds, but everything's connected.
Enjoying the experience when you get here. Right? All those things are deeply personal. Well, what if there is an axiological, a value explanation for the whole universe, right? That's like saying, well, a natural explanation for the universe doesn't have to involve God. I mean, when I do car mechanics, I don't keep saying, oh, God will change the spark plugs, or why do these spark plugs get so dirty, couldn't God have cleaned them before I got out of it? You don't say things like that. You just get on with it. God doesn't come into it. Well, when you're asking questions about how can I live with myself in a world like this where I want to love everybody, I think it's a good idea in principle, but I don't like most of them, especially my neighbours who happen to have a very noisy dog. If you're here, I just... You say, well, looking at the whole of the world, violent, catastrophic, all terrible stuff going on, you think, am I supposed to have compassion and sympathy for all these beings? Well, yes, but. Now, for me, I have to tell you, the only thing that makes sense of that morality is, well, I can't love them. I think they're pretty horrible on the whole. But if God loves them, I've bloody well got to love them. And you think, that's it. If that's a command of God, and God is saying, love is what you're made to do, I've got to do it. And that makes a huge difference in morality. So I do think religion makes a practical difference. It makes a difference about the values you have and the way you incorporate them into your life and how your life gets transformed by it. So it comes down to this. In the end,
It's a very good point. Not necessarily religion, but just God. I wouldn't say religion, because religion is a certain way of interpreting the nature of reality and of God, when underneath all of them is just God.
Is there a consciousness of the cosmos which can transform my life if I am disciplined enough to practice meditation, contemplative prayer, and just being quiet with beauty and with goodness, and try to make my life a small imitation of that perfect beauty, which is what God really is. Think of God as perfect beauty. And then ask the question, does science make that idea obsolete? I can't see how it would. So while I'm a complete devotee of science, and I want scientists to go on doing all the wonderful things they are doing, I don't want anyone to say, and that takes away the glory and the beauty of worship, of appreciation of art, of commitment to morality, of a life of seeking to love more than you do. Those are important things in life. We would like science to help us to do this. We ask science to be our friend to help us to do this, but not to say, it doesn't even explain anything because it's obsolete. I think that we should say, God will remain a leading, controlling idea of the human mind. And in fact, we'd want to say, as Einstein said, well, God is the really interesting thing. All the rest is talk. Thank you.
Well, thank you, our two debaters, for a very intriguing beginning of the evening. Now we have a 5 minutes rebuttal from Michael, and then a 5 minutes rebuttal from Professor Ward.
Okay. Oh, boy. There was a lot there. Okay, well, sir, first of all, people don't go to church to hear lectures about the Higgs boson or the Big Bang theory. That's true. I mean, religion has a social value. I wasn't bringing that up because that wasn't really what we're debating. A different debate would be, to what extent do people still need religion? Is religion a force for good or evil in the world? Something like that. But we were discussing that, but that's okay. I think it's an interesting point because, yes, people go to get inspirational sermons, maybe invocation to do right instead of wrong. Don't forget to help the charities. The great music, the free parking. I mean, there's a lot of value in religion, for sure. That's there, irrelevant whether there's a God or not. I mean, there's lots of secular versions of religions. Unitarian Universalists, they're practically non-believers. Buddhism and so forth, these are really quite non-Western traditions. They're Eastern mystical traditions in which people get the same values without anything remotely like personalized God. So that's okay. We can recognize that. And us seculars do the same thing. Here we are on a Monday night. We're socializing. We can hang out afterwards. And that's a social. There's lots of ways to get that. And religion is just one of many. In the same way that we can all appreciate dance, music, art, and so forth. Those are sort of higher order factors of the human condition whose explanation is sort of a higher level explanation. Yes, you can start with electrons or quantum fields or something like that, but no one does that. When Vernon here studies the economy, he doesn't start with electrons. He starts with people, presumably, and money, and currency and financial laws and so on. These are higher levels of explanation. You don't need to start with the quantum fields. And so I'm not sure what the point of that was. I would just say, well, of course. Now there's things like love. Love. Science can't explain love. Well, you know what you call love without evidence? Stalking. Think about that for a second. Just think about that for a second. It's not a given. You have to earn it to a certain extent. You have to give. It's give and take. And if you forget your sweethearts, whatever the date is or whatever, yeah, there's a concern there. You didn't say I love you for 3 days in a row. What's going on with you? I mean, it is in a way a thing you can study, and we do study it. There are anthropologists who study it, marriage counselors study it. You can tell within 5 minutes of a couple's facial expressions. When she rolls her eyes when he says something, this is a bad sign. This is a 90% probability they're not going to make it through the marriage counseling. Okay? So all of this is not to take anything away from the experience of feeling it, but of course we can study it and understand it. It's a part of the human condition, all of which should be within the realm of something we can study scientifically. So this word consciousness is commonly used without it being defined. So in your 5 minutes, you can give us your definition. I just mean as it's a word we use to describe what the brain does. So I don't think there's any such thing as mind. I think a mind is just what the brain does. It's what we call these patterns of neural networks firing and so forth, and the experience we have, or vision, or moral feelings, or whatever. And to a certain extent, I'm right, because when somebody gets a stroke or injury, that part of the brain, if that dies, the function is gone. The mind function, the conscious awareness of, say, a face. Faces are detected right about here in the fusiform gyrus of the temporal lobe. If somebody has a stroke there or injury, they get face blindness. They can't see a face. Look in the mirror. They don't even, who's that? Really? So where did the face consciousness go when the fusiform gyrus died? Where is it? It's gone. Where does Aunt Millie's mind go when her brain dies of Alzheimer's? Neurons are dying. They're dying just at huge rates, and consciousness just gone. Memory's gone. Personality. Where is it without the neural tissue, without the template? Okay, so where is consciousness stored? Out there somewhere. What's the template to hold it? We know what it is for us with brains. If you posit that consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe, where is it? How do you measure it? What's the template? If God is consciousness, well, where? Inquiring minds want to know. What's the explanation? Not just that there's some spooky quantum experiments where if you stare at it or not, it affects it. You don't need a conscious being, a sentient being. A camera will do the trick. You don't need consciousness for that. And anyway, so in conclusion then, I think this is all very interesting. And I agree, love is important. And all the value language is part of the human experience, but it's not an explanation in and of itself. It's a descriptive term. These are descriptive terms to describe what we experience.
Thank you. Keith?
Okay. Well, that's the key thing, consciousness. Michael said, mind is what the brain does. And if a person with Alzheimer's loses their brain functions, they lose their mind altogether. And I want to say, is that a scientific remark? Is that something that science has shown? And I think everyone who considers this dispassionately would say, no, science hasn't shown that. It's a philosophical theory. And there are competing philosophical theories among scientists themselves. And you may or may not go with my own view, which is that mind is not something that is limited to the human brain. Michael asked the question, where is God? As though, this is a self-evidently stupid question because God isn't anywhere. All right, where are mathematical truths? I believe there are mathematical truths. I think there are such things. I think they're very important. And a lot of mathematicians, not all of them, but a lot of them would say, yeah, there are certainly mathematical truths. And where are they? Well, they're not in space. Obviously, not in space. That doesn't mean they don't exist. It's not a stupid question. You just think, well, to ask a spatial question about something is just to get your category mistake. You've got mixed up there. And in the same way, a consciousness which is unembodied, just imagine that. I don't see why you can't imagine it. It wouldn't be anywhere. That's not stupid. If you believe in the multiverse, and I say, look, there's another universe parallel to this somewhere else, and you say, where? And I say, there isn't anywhere because it's not in this space, so it's nowhere as far as we're concerned. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I think you just have to get a bit more sophisticated and say, actually, the question where only applies to things in space. And the question is, aren't there things that aren't in space? Let me give you one that I think is not in space. My dreams. I dreamt last night that I was in Oxford, and I was cold and wet and miserable, as usual. And I was there. I was walking around in the rain. But where was I? Where? I wasn't in my head. I wasn't anywhere in public space. So I think it's just a piece of primitive mythology that we exist in public space and there's nowhere else, there's nothing else. So why not say, no, actually consciousness doesn't exist in space at all. You've got it wrong. Just as thoughts don't exist in space. Let me ask one little question. How long does a thought take? Have you ever tried to measure the time of your thoughts? So there's a different experience of consciousness. And Michael wants me to define consciousness. Nobody defines what they know more clearly than they know anything else because it doesn't need any definition. I can't define time to you. I can give you a mathematical equation about time, but I can't define time because I know that's what I'm going through. It's the thing that I most experience. It's the same with consciousness. Consciousness is awareness of objects. Thought objects like camels and unicorns and highest prime numbers. Some of them are false, but some of them not. So thought objects, physical objects, all sorts of objects. Consciousness is simply awareness of objects, right, for a start. That's a basic level of it. But you can't define it more than that. You only get into trouble when you try to make it physical. So that's my bottom line. I really don't think all things are physical, and I think that people believe in God, and I think actually people from so-called Eastern religions believe in something more like God than anything else, something of wisdom, compassion, and bliss, which is greater than humanity and with which one can unite in some way. And I believe that's a proper path towards God too. So that's the question. Do you really think everything's in space? If not, then God is not obsolete. It's a question where your whole approach to life might be at stake.
Thank you.
It's one of those things also when we say, where is God? That it's so in our face and so constant and all the time that we don't even notice. Because the universe itself is God. It's not some difference. They're the same thing. And so when we're looking for God within God, anyway, that was pretty interesting. Sorry, I took forever talking, but hopefully this was enjoyable to watch. If not, so be it. I'm just gonna go ahead and finish this and then end this video. I thought that was it was good to watch and share my responses too. I'm glad I reacted to this video for several reasons.
Well, I want to thank the audience. You've been fantastic. Thank you for your participation. For those of you who have been at Chapman for the first time, I hope you enjoyed the place. I hope you can take a little tour around the campus. It's a beautiful campus. We host a lot of very interesting events, and we hope you come back again. And I want to say thank you to our two debaters who have been really fantastic. Thank you and good night.
All right, so again, this is Chapman University. I'll put the somewhere the link up here, I think, will be to this, as well as in the description of the video. And thanks for watching. I'll see you guys around. Hope you enjoyed. Later.